Last week I built up these iron horses, the Western Jetbike models for the Wild West Exodus game. Whilst you're intended to make two of the same for that game, I decided to take advantage of the vast variety of parts in the kit and make up one up-armoured Iron Eagle pattern and one as a lightweight civilian runaround. And all I need to do now is colour them in. So hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and let's get to painting. I started with the Iron Eagle, and as I mentioned previously, I have this model in a few pieces to make it easier to paint. I wanted to practice a technique that I've done a few times recently, and for that I need to completely cover the grey primer with a metallic paint, albeit a diluted down metallic. To help the cowcatcher stand out as being different, it is an iconic part of this kit after all, I mixed some brown and silver together, but for the rest of the body and the rider as well, I mixed the same silver with a black instead, just to dull it down without changing the hue too much. And the first layer was mixed very heavily with the black, making for kind of a burned metal look, but over the top of that I immediately dry brushed a kind of black silver mix with more silver in it. And the idea of all of this is to give me a lot of variation and inconsistency in the underlayer of the metallic that will add a lot of visual texture to the finished model. I also made sure that the rider got a strong silver dry brush, with pure silver this time, to make sure that they are nicely visible inside the various armour panels that might swallow them up visually. To add at least a little colour at some point over all of this steel, I grabbed my blue-grey, a favourite paint of mine, and I painted all of the armour surfaces around the model. Depending on the style of painting, you can easily do a second coat for a nice, consistent, smooth coat, but I have a different plan. It strikes me that one thin and patchy coat is a technique that I use a lot. But it will be getting a second coat, as these brushstrokes aren't the style I want, but just not a smooth, thin second coat. Rather, I'm stippling in another coat of the same blue-grey, and wherever the stipples land it leaves it fairly opaque, but in the gaps leaves that patchy underlayer still subtly visible, giving a lot of that visual texture that I kept talking about. You might also notice that I'm focusing the stippling in the middle of each panel and leaving the corners and edges more ragged. And I've done this technique for an entire vehicle recently in my AB41. It's called modulation, or framing for each module, surface, panel, with a slightly darker edge to make them visually distinct. And it's another technique that I like, and it works very well with the stippling. I decided to do the same on the rider's body panels, thighs, shins and shoulders, but these really weren't so visible by the end of painting. Whilst I did like the blue, grey and steel combination, I really needed some warmth to the colouring, and what better way in a Western setting than by adding some brass or copper. So I went over the joining pieces in the armour panels with a rose gold paint mixed with brown to make sure that it gives a nice consistent coat. And I have every intention to highlight this up later, because I'm about to douse this model in a wash, which is something I seem to always do these days. Now I wanted to keep a little bit of warmth in the overall painting, and so for that I used my brown wash. But oddly, there's some combination of pigments between the brown in my brown wash and the various pigments in the blue-grey that I painted the armour panel with that give a murky green hue, and whilst this is an interesting effect, it's certainly something to keep in mind for future projects, it is not what I wanted for this specific model. And because of this, no sooner was the wash dry, in fact it wasn't fully dry in the recesses, I redid my stippling of blue-grey over the armour panels. It was slightly annoying to have to redo the painting of this exact same step, but it did smooth out my original layers whilst adding to the variation on the surface. And so I'm going to claim that it's overall a benefit to how I was painting, and it does add to the effect. I did remember to edge highlight all of the brass with a bright shiny gold, and oh, I love me an edge highlight, this made it look really interesting. One small aesthetic detail that I like in biking is a different coloured helmet to the clothes and bike. It also subtly adds a little bit of safety, breaking up the monotone colour makes you a bit more visible. For the model, however, I painted the robot face panels with some tan, 2 nice thin coats for an opaque look, and I can paint it that way if it suits. Just for the last few details and cleanup, a spot of green for the eye lens, a little blue for the headlight, and I did have to clean up the metal headlight protector, but that's absolutely fine. But just a few little bits here and there and the Iron Eagle is complete, and I can move on to the lighter built Jetbike. I started in a very similar way to the first, coating the whole model in a dark silver, silver and black mixed together, but this time with slightly less black than I had the previous time for a cold steel look. And then I got stuck into very similar technique for adding the colour, but this time I'm stippling on a brown-red mix, and I will highlight this up with the red unmixed later on, but I don't want to put in too much effort before I put on the wash and repeat my mistake from before. And that means getting the wash on much earlier this time, just some small pieces base coated in brown first. And for the wash, I am sticking with a cool black to offset the warm red and brown. After that, the bike itself doesn't need too much more. I'm actually quite liking how it looks just with those simple steps. I of course went over the red with some more stippling, painted the skull and headlight on the front, and whilst I was tempted to put a glow effect on the engine, I didn't feel it was really all that needed. And so just to paint the rider. I started with those Western blue jeans, and I have a lovely dark blue that is, unfortunately, a gloss paint. And so I pretty much have to mix it at least 50-50 with a matte paint, if not a higher ratio of matte, to make sure that I can paint further layers of highlights on the top, because that gloss just doesn't like things sticking to it. For the denim, it actually makes a pretty reasonable tone with the light blue that I have, even if I can't ever quite make the texture work how I want it to. Something to practice, I guess. I also made an interesting mistake along the way because I put my model on the painting handle directly upright. However, when she's on the bike, she will be leaning forwards. And this means I put a lot of effort into her front, her thighs, her face and her shirt, whereas I really should have paid more attention to her back, her calves, and her hair, obviously. And this was actually fairly easy to deal with. I just added extra highlighting at the end once the model was fully assembled. As there was plenty of vibrant colours going on this model, I felt it was perfectly okay with a cool biker chick black leather jacket. But to give it just a little bit of interest, I mixed in some of the black with my dark brown for the base coat. And then I highlighted directly from there into grey, and I gave a little bit of extra shadow with a pure black. Meaning that the brown is very, very subtle and almost not visible, but it still makes it look more interesting than if I just painted it plain black and grey. And yes, I was totally tempted to paint flames or a skull or something on the jacket, but I've already put off this model for several months. I should probably do some freehand soon. I do like freehand. I mentioned her face earlier, and I've been trying something a little different recently. By using a bruised purple as the base colour and highlighting into the same Caucasian paint that I usually use, this certainly gives a different skin tone to my usual, and given how bad that looks, anything would be an improvement, right? Well, I gave it a good try, and I layered up quite a few more layers than I usually do to have a smooth effect on it, and it looks fine. That kind of bruised purple does give the red pigment of blood under the skin. Maybe it looks like she's sunburned, but whatever. I just need a bit more practice, I think. The last bit for the rider here was the hair, and why not a bright red head on a bright red bike. In a slight change, rather than mixing my base coat layer, that first layer went on as a pure dark brown, with some splotches of a 50-50 mix with orange up in the middle. And after that I started to pick out the hair in an unmixed orange several times to strengthen it, but also to lightly transition from the darker colour up to that orange. This orange paint is fairly translucent as acrylic paints go, and so going up several layers like this meant that the highest points just ended up naturally being quite strong orange, and at the edges of where I was painting ended up with just that thin little subtle hint of orange, almost working as a glaze, although I'm not going to pretend it's a glaze because it's not quite. And there we go, two really cool models for Wild West Exodus painted up. One is an iron eagle with a few bits missing from the rider, and the other is an iron horse with the cowcatcher removed. I really like the style of these, and the vast quantity of options and extras you get in the kit makes for a really fun building process, even if you're just going along with the standard wants for the game. However, I will not be playing this game. Well, I probably will at some point, but not with these models just yet. Maybe someday. These specific models will be used in a different game that I will be mentioning soon. Please let me know in the comments below what you think of my build choices and painting, and as YouTube seems to have cast me into the pit recently, do feel free to share this video in any group that you might also like it. I would also entertain ideas for all of those spare parts. I have some ideas already, and my 3D printer is already making some interesting things for them. But for now, I will say, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.